And Gazprom contractually was now on the hook for paying the Germans for replacement supplies at whatever price the Germans had to pay to get those supplies. So, up by a factor of 8 almost overnight. But if force majeure kicked in, then that all goes away. So, that's my theory. Anyway, third and perhaps most importantly, the Swedes are 100% positive who did it. They say they've got proof, but if they provide proof that it was the Russians, then Europe has to cease trading completely with the Russians overnight, because you cannot have a trading partner that is targeting your critical infrastructure. And so the Swedes have been asked unofficially to sit on the information. They've been sitting on it now for almost 6 months. And the Danes also supposedly have information, and they're getting a little bit more antsy than even the Swedes, because, the Danes are already in NATO, whereas Sweden is still in the waiting room. So we're probably reaching a point fairly soon where some Scandinavian is going to leak this information out and force Berlin and Paris and the rest to do some very difficult things in a very short period of time. Luckily, the Europeans have had over a year now to cut their dependency upon the Russian space, and honestly, it's going a lot better than I had any reason to expect at the beginning. Hirsch's take is based on one interview with one unnamed source, and the way that it was outlined is not how the United States carries out special operations, so I'm going to put that in the category of absolute bullshit. That is the concern in the United States, in London, and across Ukraine and all of Central Europe, is that the Germans will look for a way to go back to how things were. We're now at a point, I would argue, that even if the politics were right, the economics will never line up again. Most of the Russian commodities are produced in the permafrost. It's a territory that slows and buckles and bends, and the Russians cannot maintain that output in the long term without massive amounts of external funding and, more importantly, external labor, because their labor force is in a state of collapse. So the only way we can go back to 2020 in terms of energy and commodity supplies is if we have the war resolved, or at least settled overnight, and then someone steps forward with at least €1 trillion worth of investment, not for Ukraine, for Russia. German success these last 75 years has been based on 3 factors. Number one, a very high level of labor skill for precision manufacturing. Number two, access to various industrial bases throughout the European space in order to build a differentiated supply chain system for doing the parts of the labor system that are not as capital intensive and not as labor intensive and not as skill intensive. So basically, Poland is your Mexico, to oversimplify. And then third, a globalized system that allows the Germans to access low-cost, high-reliability imported raw materials, especially energy, but also end markets that can absorb all of this product, because the Germans produce significantly more product than they could ever consume, not just in Europe, not just at home, but in Europe as well. All 3 of those pillars are now gone. The German population has been aging for decades, and this was always going to be the decade that the bulge in the German population moves from the 50s and early 60s into mass retirement. So the labor force is no longer there. Second, the European system, that differentiated supply chain, most of the countries that Germany has integrated with have demographics that are just as bad. So Poland is actually aging faster than Germany. They're just a little bit younger. But the Netherlands is nearly as bad. Austria is nearly as bad. So the ability to maintain the production system from a labor point of view is going to get significantly weaker. And then probably third, most importantly, the Russian stuff's gone. It's not coming back. And as we've seen in the United States, people around the world are celebrating that it's Joe Biden and not Donald Trump. But with the exception, the one exception of Airbus, Boeing, that's spat. That one has been put to the side, partially resolved. With the exception of that, every trade dispute that Donald Trump initiated, Biden has doubled and tripled down on, and he's now putting industrial policy in the mix for the first time in the United States since the 1940s. And this means that the United States is no longer interested at all in maintaining the globalized system. The deal that made globalization work was that we will patrol the ocean so that anyone can trade with anyone and access anything, and we will leave our markets open if you let us write your security policies to fight the Soviets. You may have noticed in all of the deal making that the Biden administration has done around the world, and especially in Europe, that's not the deal anymore. All the security agreements are purely bilateral. There are no economic hangers on. And Biden is taking the American economy home and basically shutting its doors to one region after another, and that includes Europe as well. And that leaves Germany with China. And if you think that your dependence upon Russia has generated some interesting geopolitical exposure, just wait till we get to a real argument between the Chinese and the Americans. Sure. Let me start by saying I do consider myself a green. Unfortunately, I'm also a green that can do basic math, and that means a lot of the greens just don't invite me to their parties. Okay, we've got lots of issues, but let's focus on the big three. There's an understanding in the world of environmental energy that you only put up wind turbines in places where the wind blows fairly strongly. There is not an understanding in the green community that you only put up solar panels in places where the sun shines brightly. So the location of these things really matters. Now, I live at roughly 2,300 meters in the highlands above what used to be called the Great American Desert in Colorado. That means that my solar panels generate 7 times as much electricity as the same panels would in Berlin. That means I'm in one of the world's best solar zones, and Berlin is in almost the world's worst. And if you're going to put up 7 times as much paneling in order to generate the same amount of electricity, you have now generated so much carbon by putting up those panels that you will never be able to generate enough electricity to pay down the carbon debt, much less the economic debt. It's just not a good geography for that technology. So that's problem one. Most of the population of the world lives in a place that is much more similar to Berlin than Denver, unfortunately. Number two, if we are serious about doing the green transition in its current form with the current technologies that we have, then we need more materials than we currently have, and we have to be able to process them. So in terms of volume, we need 10 times as much nickel, 18 times as much graphite, probably 3 times as much copper, and we need it all by 2030. We have never doubled the volume of any industrial material in human history, if it's something that we already had in use, ever. And we now need to do this and then some for 11 different materials. That is not physically possible. And then there's a processing issue. Right now, it depends, it varies wildly based on the material. Roughly 3/4 of the processing of these 11 different materials is done in either Russia or China. We're going to lose the Russia stuff in total because of economic breakdown. And in my opinion, we're going to lose a lot of the Chinese stuff due to political breakdown. Simply taking silicon, building that processing capacity somewhere outside of China can be done, but it's going to almost triple the price of silicon because the Chinese subsidize everything. So all of our price metrics that we've done are wrong, but the real issue is availability. Oil, we understand the economics and the geopolitics of the oil era. It means you have to deal with a lot of different places that are kind of ugly. But if we want to do the energy transition, not only do we have to deal with a lot more places that are ugly, there's not enough for everyone. One of the great parts of globalization is the United States kept the world's petroleum market open for everyone. We didn't get involved in the Middle East because we thought it was fun. We didn't even get involved in the Middle East because we needed the crude. We got our crude from North America. We did it for Germany and France and Italy and Korea and Japan and even China.